The sky over the North Sea was quiet, too quiet. A lone NATO fighter cruised just below the cloud layer, running a patrol near the air defense identification zone. But 200 miles east, 4 MiG 23 seconds streaked low across the radar horizon, coordinated, fast, and invisible. Soviet controllers on the Kaliningrad coast believed this was the perfect trap. Fast interceptors, undetected until the last second, set to ambush a NATO asset before it could react. It was textbook Soviet doctrine: deception through speed, concealment through distance. But what they didn't know was that the trap had already failed. At 30,000 feet, orbiting silently over the English coast, flew an aircraft unlike anything the Soviets had prepared for. The E-3 Sentry AWACS. It didn't chase targets. It saw them. All of them. All the time. The AWACS had picked up the MiG flight the second they lifted off. Their vector, altitude, airspeed, and approach pattern had already been calculated. Before the MiGs were even halfway to intercept range, the E-3 had relayed the ambush coordinates to every fighter in the sector. The NATO patrol wasn't walking into a trap. It was bait. And when the MiGs pushed into range, the skies erupted not with surprise, but with precision. Allied fighters swung wide from their holding patterns, dropping low and turning in with pre-locked missiles. Within seconds, the ambush collapsed, Soviet pilots disengaging, retreating back across the border, radios jammed, formation broken. What had gone wrong? They never saw the AWACS. They never knew they'd been tracked, and they never expected their tactics to be watched from above. Because Soviet doctrine had always assumed radar had limits, range, resolution, curvature. Their ambushes were based on hiding behind Earth's geometry. But now, that geometry had been nullified by a 30-ton disk circling above the clouds, seeing everything. The E-3 Sentry didn't just detect aircraft. It dismantled the very concept of air surprise. And over the next 30 years, it would expose ambush after ambush, until Soviet and later Russian pilots were forced to ask themselves a terrifying question every time they took off. Who's watching us now? The Soviet Union didn't fear American radar systems. They studied them, countered them, jammed them, and often dismissed them. From early warning stations to shipborne arrays, U.S. radar was seen as linear, predictable, and susceptible to the same flaws that plagued all ground-based detection: curvature of the Earth, terrain masking, clutter. Their doctrine reflected this. The Soviets believed in speed and surprise. High-speed interceptors like the MiG-25 and MiG-23 weren't designed to dogfight. They were meant to exploit radar gaps, ambush slower targets, then retreat before Western command structures could respond. It wasn't just a tactic. It was the backbone of how the USSR intended to win the air war. And it worked until the E-3 arrived. The E-3 Sentry didn't play by the same rules. Mounted with a rotating APY-1 radar capable of seeing over 250 miles in every direction, flying at 30,000 feet, the aircraft erased the concept of radar blind spots. It watched from above, not from ground level. What Soviet planners had treated as gaps were now completely visible. Still, Soviet command refused to acknowledge the threat. When the U.S. introduced AWACS into NATO air exercises in the late 1970s, Soviet radar technicians dismissed it as vulnerable. Too large to survive, one Warsaw Pact training memo noted. If spotted, it will be destroyed immediately. But that assumption missed the point. The AWACS wasn't there to fight. It was there to see. And what it saw was shared instantly via secure data links to every fighter, tanker, and command post within the theater. This changed the nature of NATO air defense from reactive to predictive. In one 1982 air exercise, F-15 seconds under AWACS control were able to intercept simulated enemy bombers before those aircraft had even reached launch points. Soviet observers, watching from East German posts, noted the unnatural timing of NATO reactions. They chalked it up to guesswork, luck, but the truth was much worse. The E-3 was building a live picture of the battlefield, one the Soviets couldn't see and didn't believe could exist, because Soviet theory still hinged on a critical belief that air superiority belonged to whoever struck first. They hadn't yet realized that with AWACS in the sky, NATO would always strike second, but with perfect information. By the early 1980 seconds, Soviet air doctrine was already showing signs of strain. The MiG-23, their frontline interceptor, had been exposed as unstable at low speeds and blind in close combat. Radar coverage across the Warsaw Pact was fragmented, and fighter pilots were still tethered to ground controllers reacting to threats instead of anticipating them. But worst of all, the doctrine remained rooted in vertical warfare. Detect from the ground, intercept from below, strike before the enemy could see you. This model worked when radar was static and limited when the sky could still hide its secrets. The E-3 AWACS destroyed that illusion. In NATO simulations, the AWACS was no longer just an observer. It became the brain of the air operation. With its massive radar dome sweeping 360 degrees every 10 seconds, the Sentry tracked hundreds of aircraft simultaneously, friend and foe coordinating intercepts, relaying target vectors, and even predicting where enemy fighters would be, not just where they were. Soviet pilots trained for minutes of engagement time. Now, they had seconds. The E-3 eliminated the fog of war. Fighter squadrons that would have taken minutes to lock targets now received them pre-sorted before takeoff. The AWACS didn't just give commands, it curated battle space. Soviet generals tried to respond with brute force. More interceptors, tighter radar nets, faster missile lock times. But they misunderstood the shift. It wasn't about speed alone. It was about coherence. NATO had begun waging war as a network. The AWACS sat at the center. Meanwhile, the USSR remained stuck in a hierarchy. Pilots waited for orders from the ground. Radar operators relied on static detection. Ambushes required surprise, but now every MiG vector was already lit up like a flare. Worse still, Soviet fighters were flying blind. The MiG-21, MiG-23, and even early MiG 29 seconds had radar with limited look-down capability and narrow detection arcs. In contrast, the E-3 tracked aircraft regardless of altitude or angle, and it did so from a position where no terrain or curvature could hide an approaching threat. It wasn't just that the AWACS saw more. It saw first, and for a doctrine built on first strikes, that changed everything. Still, the Soviets refused to rewire their command structure. They trained more pilots, built more SAM sites, pushed radar further forward, but they didn't break the doctrine, so the doctrine was about to break them. The date was the 3rd of March 1984. A NATO exercise in the Norwegian Sea was underway, but what unfolded would later be cited in classified Soviet after-action reviews as a probability-defying engagement. 4 Norwegian F-16 seconds were flying a routine patrol along the Norwegian coast low, uneventful, and within their assigned radar coverage. Soviet intelligence had already charted the engagement window. From the Kola Peninsula, 4 MiG-23 MLDs took off under strict radio silence, descending into the radar gaps along the Barents coast. Their mission: execute a surprise intercept, lock on, and force a NATO withdrawal to test response times. It was the perfect ambush, at least on paper. But what the Soviet strike package didn't realize was that circling 150 miles behind the F-16 seconds, well beyond any radar they expected, was an E-3 Sentry. Its dome had picked up the MiG flight the moment they banked over Murmansk. Every maneuver, every descent, every fuel burn, every radar silence. By the time the MiGs reached the boundary of the ambush zone, the F-16 seconds had already adjusted course. They weren't retreating, they were waiting. The E-3 hadn't just detected the MiGs, it had parsed their vector, speed, and approach patterns, and computed their likely engagement arcs. That data relayed via secure link 11 to NATO fighters enabled the F-16 seconds to pre-position themselves outside the Soviet kill box, lock on without turning their own radar on, and kill the MiGs in under 40 seconds. All 4 MiGs were digitally destroyed in the simulation before they had visual contact. It was the kind of failure Soviet planners had never imagined. Their interceptors had flown a flawless route. Their radar operators had seen nothing unusual. Their doctrine had executed perfectly. And yet, they had lost to an aircraft they never even saw. Back in Moscow, the report triggered internal confusion. Debriefs with the MiG pilots showed no equipment failures, no miscommunications. Only one possible explanation emerged, one that several GRU analysts called deeply disturbing. The E-3 AWACS had turned the ambushers into the ambushed. From that moment, Soviet war planners knew something fundamental had shifted. They were no longer dealing with isolated radar stations. They were facing a sky that could think, and this was only the beginning. The after-action reports from the Norwegian Sea reached Soviet Air Defense Command with a sense of quiet dread. The GRU's initial conclusion that the MiG ambush had been compromised by airborne radar was met with instant skepticism from senior leadership. The idea that a single aircraft, circling beyond visual range, could guide an entire engagement to such precision was dismissed as Western exaggeration. In a closed-door Politburo security briefing, one marshal of aviation scoffed. "No radar sees through the earth." His words reflected the prevailing view. AWACS was nothing more than an airborne early warning system, an oversized antenna with limited tactical utility. Soviet doctrine still leaned heavily on ground control, fixed radar sites, and centralized command. The idea that the Americans had fused radar, data, and decision-making into one platform sounded more like science fiction than battlefield reality. But the evidence kept mounting. In East Germany, Soviet radar crews began logging unusual radio traffic during NATO exercises. Fighter formations were maneuvering with uncanny timing, reacting to invisible threats, repositioning faster than GCI stations could calculate. NATO pilots weren't responding, they were anticipating. Someone was painting the battlefield in real time. Still, the Kremlin's top brass clung to disbelief. They pointed to the AWACS's size, its lack of stealth, its presumed vulnerability. "Shoot it down," they said. "One missile and the whole system collapses." But in practice, the E-3 never flew alone. It operated behind layers of protection, escorted by F-15 seconds, supported by tanker corridors, watched over by surveillance satellites. And because it never had to enter enemy airspace, it never came within reach of Soviet SAM systems. The very doctrines that demanded fixed engagement zones and rigid air corridors had made it untouchable. Even as Warsaw Pact allies raised concerns about their own radar performance, Moscow doubled down. New fighter production accelerated. ECM development was prioritized. But no program, no pilot, and no patch of sky could answer the one question that no one dared speak aloud. What if the Americans could now see everything? And even worse, what if they knew what we were going to do before we did it? The denial wasn't just technological, it was existential. Because to admit the truth of the E-3 AWACS was to admit that the Soviet Union had lost control of the one thing it valued above all, the battle space. As NATO air victories began stacking up across exercises and edge of border patrols, Soviet command needed answers. But instead of facing the unsettling truth that American AWACS had revolutionized command and control, they reached for a more comfortable explanation: luck. According to internal memos circulated within the Soviet 16th Air Army, Western air patrols weren't winning because of better intelligence. They were simply positioned more aggressively, guided by chance, or flying blind and getting lucky. 1985. Analysis of a failed MiG-29 intercept near West Germany concluded. The enemy flight altered course, coincidentally, resulting in positional advantage. No AWACS signature confirmed in the area. No AWACS signature. Not because it wasn't there, but because Soviet radar systems couldn't detect it. The E-3, operating far behind the front lines at high altitude, remained invisible to the frontline radars and too distant for fighters to track. Its signal management and constant orbit shifts made it blend into civilian traffic patterns. But Moscow leaned on this theory desperately. New tactics were ordered. More MiG flights were instructed to vary timing, to alter ingress angles, to deploy in 2s and 3s, hoping to catch NATO patrols off guard. Yet the outcome remained unchanged. Each time, Western fighters seemed to know where the MiGs were going, even when the MiGs hadn't finished deciding it themselves, and the more Soviet planners tried to replicate the randomness they blamed for NATO's success, the more their own doctrine began to erode. They were reacting to shadows, second-guessing timing, hesitating. The confidence in centralized control, the heart of Soviet air operations, began to wither under the illusion of randomness. But it wasn't luck. It was orchestration. The E-3 AWACS was mapping the airspace continuously, with its 360-degree radar scanning out to 250 miles. It wasn't seeing fighters. It was tracking behavior. It knew which blips meant feints, which meant engagement. It coordinated Allied responses before the MiGs reached decision altitude. But because this orchestration was silent and invisible to Soviet systems, the only conclusion left was superstition, that somehow NATO pilots were guessing correctly, again and again. By the end of 1986, Soviet exercises began reflecting this theory. Training modules referred to coincidence vectors and response anomalies. Pilots were drilled to avoid patterns not because NATO could see them, but because their patterns invited bad luck. Doctrine had devolved into magical thinking, and all the while, 30,000 feet above, a radar disk kept turning. Not lucky, just watching. By 1987, Soviet intelligence could no longer deny the pattern. MiG intercepts were being broken. Ambushes failed. NATO fighters arrived too early, positioned too well, and struck too decisively. The explanation was no longer luck, it had to be sabotage. The new theory, electronic interference. According to this view, NATO was deploying airborne jammers that were distorting Soviet radar readings. The MiGs weren't being tracked, they were being tricked. Jammed communication lines, spoofed radar returns, decoy signals. This, to Soviet scientists, was a far more acceptable explanation than the terrifying alternative, that the Americans could simply see everything. At first glance, the theory held water. NATO had invested heavily in electronic warfare. EA-6B, Prowlers, ALQ-99 pods, chaff corridors, these were known assets. The Soviets had faced these tools before, especially over Vietnam. It made sense that NATO might be blanketing the skies with deception, and so, the Soviet response was escalation. New ECM filters were rushed into service. Passive detection systems were expanded. Soviet radar operators were trained to read between the signals to spot what was missing, not just what was present. Fighter crews were briefed to expect electronic distortion and to operate under calm silence, using internal radar only. But the results were catastrophic. In one 1988 training event near the Hungarian border, 4 MiG 29 seconds were sent to intercept what radar labeled as a single F-4 Phantom. Instead, they ran headlong into a fully coordinated ambush, 2 F-15 seconds and 2 F-16 seconds, guided not by jamming, but by AWACS-fed precision. Within minutes, all 4 MiGs were declared digitally killed. None had fired a shot. No jamming had occurred. No spoofed returns. Just clarity on the NATO side. That clarity came from the E-3. The Sentry didn't need to jam or interfere. It was above the noise, above the ground clutter, terrain masking, and radar distortion. It didn't fight Soviet sensors. It simply bypassed them. Like a lighthouse in the clouds, it illuminated the battle space while Soviet radars stared into fog. Yet Soviet doctrine persisted in chasing the wrong enemy. They built anti-radiation missiles aimed at jammers that weren't there. They added frequency-hopping protocols, searching for signals that weren't being faked. And all the while, the true weapon, the intelligence fusion inside the E-3, remained untouched, unchallenged, and undefeated. The real threat wasn't in what the AWACS transmitted. It was in what it never needed to, because by the time the MiGs were in the air, the AWACS had already given NATO fighters all the information they needed. Jamming wasn't the problem. Total visibility was. By 1989, it was no longer a theory. It was a pattern the Soviet Union's own intelligence apparatus had completely failed to anticipate, analyze, or counter. The GRU and the Soviet Air Defense Forces had long believed in centralized intelligence. Their model was simple: capture NATO tactics, monitor exercises, and reverse engineer outcomes. But when it came to the E-3 Sentry, that model collapsed. Because the AWACS didn't operate like anything the Soviets had encountered before. It wasn't a radar. It wasn't a command post. It was both and neither. It was a flying nervous system. Despite field reports from Warsaw Pact allies, failed exercises, and consistent surprise engagements, Soviet intelligence never fully grasped the AWACS threat. Why? Because it didn't fit any of their categories. The E-3 wasn't a fighter. It didn't attack. It wasn't a jammer. It didn't distort. It wasn't a satellite. It didn't relay passively. It was something new. A real-time battle space manager, and the Soviet system had no vocabulary for it. Worse, their entire method of counterintelligence failed to penetrate its secrets. The E-3 was protected, encrypted, and layered behind NATO's most secure systems. Its radar waveform data was never intercepted. Its operating frequencies remained a mystery. Even the logic behind its data fusion remained locked behind classified NATO doctrine. And while Soviet planners struggled to understand the Sentry, NATO pilots were thriving under it. In after-action reports from Red Flag and other joint exercises, U.S. and Allied fighters consistently outmaneuvered and outgunned MiG simulations by 2-to-1 or greater, not because of superior airframes but because of superior awareness. Pilots didn't guess. They didn't search. They were directed. And that direction came from 30,000 feet above, via a single aircraft the Soviets had no answer for. The Soviet intelligence community tried to adapt. Reconnaissance flights focused on E-3 bases. Intercepts were ordered to approach AWACS patrols and log radar behavior. But the Sentry was always one step ahead, backed by fighter escorts, airborne tankers, and encrypted communications the Soviets couldn't break. Even the KGB failed to penetrate the AWACS command loop. No human intelligence source ever delivered a working picture of how the aircraft operated in live combat scenarios. By the end of the decade, some Soviet analysts began calling the AWACS the ghost pilot, a machine that didn't shoot, but killed entire strategies. A presence in the sky that could not be seen, touched, or decoded, but which altered every engagement, rewrote every battle, and nullified every ambush. It wasn't just an aircraft. It was a gap in Soviet imagination. And that failure, the inability to recognize what the E-3 truly was, became one of the most expensive blind spots of the entire Cold War. The Soviets thought the E-3 Sentry was just another platform, another blip in a long line of American gadgets. What they didn't see was that the Sentry wasn't just a piece of hardware. It was the keystone of a completely new way to fight a war. The true American system wasn't about firepower. It was about information dominance. While the USSR built more jets, more missiles, and more radars, the U.S. quietly built a nervous system that connected everything: jets, bombers, satellites, tankers, and carriers into a single, unified network. And the E-3 was the eye of that network. At its core was the AN/APY-1 radar, capable of scanning 360 degrees every 10 seconds, tracking over 600 targets at once, and discriminating between hostile and friendly aircraft with digital precision. But it wasn't just the hardware. It was what the system did with the data. Every radar contact was processed, identified, prioritized, and disseminated to aircraft across a theater. F-15 seconds received bearing, range, altitude, and speed of threats long before their own radars saw anything. Bombers received updates on air defenses. Command centers saw the full map. Tankers and AWACS coordinated fighter rotations like chess moves. This wasn't theory. It was live, operational reality. During Operation Desert Storm in 1991, this system came to full light. The E-3 Sentry coordinated over 100,000 sorties, deconflicted thousands of aircraft, and identified hostile movements across the entire theater. Iraqi Air Force units trained and equipped by Soviet doctrine were decimated before they could mount meaningful resistance. MiGs scrambled and died within minutes. They were tracked from takeoff to destruction. NATO fighters, fed by AWACS, engaged with precision that looked like clairvoyance. This was real-time war, and that concept was utterly foreign to the Soviet Union. Their model relied on ground-based radar, verbal commands, centralized approval, and hierarchical planning. The E-3 made that obsolete in one generation. In combat simulations, NATO pilots under AWACS control had kill ratios of 6-to-1 or better. Engagements were shorter, cleaner, and more efficient. No surprises, no guesswork. For the Soviet system built on deception, ambush, and ground control, this was death by clarity. And the brilliance of it all? The E-3 never entered the fight. It never crossed the border. It never fired a shot. It simply hovered at the edge of conflict and turned chaos into choreography. It proved that the most powerful weapon in modern war isn't a missile or a jet. It's perfect situational awareness. And while Soviet pilots searched the clouds for enemies, the E-3 sat in the sky calm, silent, and all-seeing, watching everything unfold from above. March 24, 1999, the first night of NATO's Operation Allied Force over Yugoslavia. Though the Soviet Union had collapsed nearly a decade earlier, its legacy, air doctrine, hardware, and training still lived on through the Yugoslav Air Force, staffed by officers educated in Moscow, flying aircraft built in Soviet factories, and guided by Warsaw Pact-era radar networks. They had MiG 29 seconds. They had SAM belts. They had decades of experience in ambush warfare. But what they didn't have was AWACS. The E-3 Sentry had been orbiting silently over the Adriatic for days. Its crews were plugged into every NATO aircraft flying into Serbian airspace. Dozens of strike fighters, bombers, SEAD teams, and escort squadrons. The Sentry scanned every sweep of the battle space, tracking hundreds of radar emissions, aircraft signatures, and flight profiles. And the MiGs never stood a chance. The Yugoslav command believed they could intercept NATO bombers before they hit Belgrade, but as their MiG 29 seconds launched outdated, radar-blind, and flying with malfunctioning avionics, AWACS detected them before they even reached altitude. Before the MiGs could get within 40 miles of the strike package, F-15Cs rolled in under AWACS direction and tore them apart. In one encounter, an American pilot received a full vector to target while still hundreds of miles out. He launched an AIM-120 AMRAAM beyond visual range and killed the MiG without ever seeing it. The Serbian pilot never knew what hit him. It wasn't a dogfight. It was a guided execution. Over the course of the air campaign, every MiG-29 the Yugoslavs launched was either shot down or forced to flee within minutes. Their radar sites were blinded, their airfields cratered. Their command and control centers, patterned after Soviet models, were useless in the face of a unified, real-time, AWACS-led assault. And the most painful part? The E-3 never came within range of a single missile. It remained untouchable far out to sea, directing waves of fighters like a maestro conducting a silent orchestra. Soviet advisors still embedded with Yugoslav air units were horrified. Everything they'd believed about ambush, initiative, and surprise had failed. The doctrine they had sworn by had been annihilated not by superior numbers or better aircraft, but by a flying radar dish that knew more, saw farther, and coordinated faster than anything they had imagined. They watched as their legacy was dismantled in real time, and though Yugoslavia was not the Soviet Union, Its defeat marked a symbolic collapse of the old air war paradigm. In post-mission analysis, one NATO pilot put it simply, "They came to fight. We came to win the airspace." The MiGs fell from the sky, the Sentry remained above, and the doctrine that had once terrified NATO evaporated in the face of complete visibility. By the end of the 1,990 seconds, a quiet realization settled over the remnants of the Soviet military establishment. The age of industrial air power, of swarms of interceptors, brute force radar coverage, and centralized control was over, not with a bang, but with a whisper from 30,000 feet. The E-3 Sentry hadn't just defeated a tactic. It had invalidated an entire way of thinking. Soviet air doctrine had always emphasized quantity, structure, and layers. SAM rings, interceptor belts, ground-controlled intercepts. It assumed that air battles could be managed like chessboards, predictable zones, strict orders, controlled pieces, but AWACS didn't play by those rules. It saw the entire board. And worse, it let NATO bend the board at will. For Soviet planners, this was more than a military failure. It was ideological collapse. Their system prized centralized control. AWACS proved that distributed knowledge shared instantly, horizontally was faster, more flexible, and more lethal. Soviet command relied on structured timelines. AWACS enabled real-time adaptation. Soviet pilots flew to meet targets. AWACS-guided fighters were already waiting at the kill zone. In war colleges across Russia, this shift was deeply unsettling. Entire careers had been built on intercept theory. Reaction curves, radar wave modeling, all rendered obsolete by one airborne system that required no reaction because it had already seen what was coming. It wasn't about hardware anymore, it was about architecture. The West had built a network, the East had built machines, and machines alone were not enough. The collapse of the Soviet Union only hastened this decay. Former Soviet states now watched their Cold War-era gear rendered useless in regional conflicts. In Georgia, in Syria, in Iraq. Each time, aircraft based on Soviet designs failed to counter coordinated, AWACS-led air campaigns. And with each failure, one truth became clearer. Air superiority no longer belonged to the pilot who could pull the most Gs, but to the aircraft that could see the farthest, think the fastest, and share instantly. That was the revolution the E-3 Sentry had sparked. Not in missiles, not in stealth, in command itself. What began as a flying radar became a symbol of the 21st century battlefield, quiet, aware, and omnipresent. And the doctrines it destroyed never recovered. The E-3 Sentry is still flying. Its engines may hum with the sound of the 1,970 seconds, but inside that iconic radar dome is a battlefield brain that shaped the modern world. From the frozen skies of the North Atlantic to the burning deserts of Iraq, the Sentry flew not to fight but to reveal, not to strike but to orchestrate. It never fired a missile, never dropped a bomb, but it destroyed illusions. The illusion that numbers win wars. The illusion that pilots fight alone. The illusion that the sky is still blind. In the Cold War, fear came from what you couldn't see. Silent submarines, hidden missile silos, stealth aircraft in the night. But for Soviet air defense forces, the ultimate fear came from the opposite, from something they knew was watching, but couldn't find. A ghost in the sky. Even today, long after the collapse of the USSR, Russian war planners build simulations around AWACS-class threats. Their exercises reflect paranoia born not from imagination, but from memory. Because those who served in the 1,980 seconds remember. They remember MiGs that vanished, patrols that failed, ambushes that never landed, all while a white aircraft with a spinning disc above its fuselage loitered far, far away and saw everything. Modern replacements for the Sentry are already being developed faster, stealthier, more powerful. But their mission remains the same. Control the air, not by force, but by knowing. As long as the sky remains a place of war, there will be something circling above it, watching, coordinating, waiting, and to the inheritors of Soviet doctrine, that presence still echoes with quiet dread. Because in every conflict where NATO gains the sky, one question always returns. Where's the AWACS?